What happens when a routine traffic stop spirals into a life-altering moment for everyone involved? In the morning, Officer Mark Harris, a seasoned cop with a reputation for being tough but fair, was patrolling the quiet streets of Willow Creek. His radio crackled with the usual updates, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. Ahead, a sleek black sedan rolled through a stop sign. Routine, he thought. Just another driver not paying attention. He flipped on his lights and pulled the car over. As he approached, his eyes narrowed. The driver was a young black woman, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, her face a mix of frustration and fear. She was visibly pregnant, her rounded belly pressing against the seatbelt. Mark's tone was clipped as he asked for her license and registration. She complied, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were trying to avoid any sudden gestures that might escalate the situation. But then, something shifted. Mark's eyes lingered on her a little too long, his gaze hardening. He noticed the out-of-state plates, the expensive car, the designer handbag on the passenger seat. His mind raced with assumptions, and before he knew it, his voice took on an edge. "Step out of the car, ma'am," he ordered, his hand resting on his holster. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Excuse me? I didn't do anything wrong," she protested, her voice trembling. But Mark wasn't listening. His instincts, or maybe his biases, had taken over. What he didn't know was that the woman, Alicia Thompson, was not just any driver. She was the wife of Police Chief Daniel Thompson, a man known for his unwavering commitment to justice and equality. And as Alicia stood there, her hands raised, her heart pounding, she couldn't help but wonder how this moment would change everything. For her, for Mark, and for the entire town of Willow Creek. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. A small crowd had begun to gather, their murmurs growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. Mark's partner, Officer Lisa Ramirez, arrived on the scene, her eyes darting between Alicia and Mark. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Mark hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. He knew he had crossed a line, but it was too late to turn back now. And then, just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down, Officer Harris." It was Chief Thompson, his presence commanding and his expression unreadable. The crowd fell silent, their eyes glued to the man who held the power to change everything with a single word. Mark froze, his heart sinking as he realized the gravity of his mistake. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a moment that would define his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his humanity. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the street, Alicia stood tall, her eyes locked on her husband. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice, about accountability, about the kind of world they wanted to build for their unborn child. And as the weight of the moment settled over them all, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The street seemed to hold its breath as Chief Daniel Thompson stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the asphalt. His uniform, usually a symbol of authority, now felt heavy under the weight of the moment. His eyes flicked to Alicia, his wife, standing there with her hands still raised, her face a mixture of relief and defiance. Then his gaze shifted to Officer Harris, who stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his holster. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional shuffle of feet from the growing crowd. "Officer Harris," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "lower your hand." "Now." Mark hesitated, his face flushing with a mix of shame and confusion. Slowly, he let his hand drop to his side, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the situation had finally caught up to him. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Mark's. Explain to me why my wife is standing here, in the middle of the street, being treated like a criminal." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His mind raced, trying to piece together a justification, but every thought felt hollow. He glanced at Alicia, who was now rubbing her wrists, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I thought she was," he stammered, his voice trailing off. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "You thought what, officer? That she was a threat? That she didn't belong here? What exactly were you thinking?" The crowd murmured, their whispers carrying a mix of anger and disbelief. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking, "Why is that lady in trouble, Mommy?" His mother shook her head, her eyes filled with sadness. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't know." Alicia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Daniel," she said softly, "it's okay. Let's just go home." But Daniel shook his head, his expression resolute.
"No, Alicia.
"This isn't okay. This can't just be swept under the rug." He turned to Mark, his tone softening but still firm. "Officer Harris, you're going to take a few days off. We'll discuss this further, but right now, I need you to go home and think about what just happened here." Mark nodded, his face pale. He turned and walked back to his patrol car, his steps heavy with regret. As he drove away, the crowd began to disperse, their whispers fading into the crisp autumn air. But the tension lingered, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Back at the Thompson household, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. Alicia sat on the couch, her hands resting on her belly, her mind replaying the events of the day. Daniel sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alicia nodded, but her eyes told a different story. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "But Daniel, this isn't just about me. This is about something bigger, something that needs to change." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said, "and I promise you, we're going to address this. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't matter." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window, where the golden leaves were still clinging to the trees. "But right now, I just need to know that you're okay. That our baby is okay." Alicia placed a hand on his, her touch warm and reassuring. "We're okay," she said softly. "But Daniel, this can't be the end of it. We have to do something. We have to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. "You're right," he said, "and we will. But for now, let's just focus on us, on our family." He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I love you, Alicia, and I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Alicia smiled, her eyes finally filling with tears. "I love you too," she whispered, "and I'm proud of you, proud of us." They sat there in silence, the weight of the day slowly lifting as they held on to each other, finding strength in their love and their shared commitment to making the world a better place. But outside, the world kept turning. The story of what had happened on that quiet street in Willow Creek began to spread, first through whispers, then through social media, until it reached the ears of everyone in town. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the horizon, one thing became clear. This was not just a story about a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a story about justice, about accountability, and about the power of love to overcome even the darkest moments. And it was far from over. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The story of Alicia's encounter with Officer Harris spread like wildfire, first through Willow Creek, then beyond. Social media lit up with hashtags and heated debates. News outlets picked it up, their headlines screaming for attention. Police chief's wife detained in shocking traffic stop, and racial bias in Willow Creek? A community demands answers. The town, once a quiet haven, was now at the center of a national conversation. Daniel tried to shield Alicia from the chaos, but it was impossible. Reporters camped outside their home, their cameras and microphones poised to capture every word. Alicia, though shaken, refused to hide. She knew her voice mattered, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of injustice. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the endless comments and messages, she turned to Daniel. "I need to say something," she said, her voice firm. "I can't just stay silent." Daniel hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in. "Alicia, I don't want you to have to relive all of this. It's not fair to you." She reached for his hand, her grip steady. "It's not about fair, Daniel. It's about doing what's right. If I don't speak up, who will?" He sighed, knowing she was right. "Okay," he said finally. "But we'll do it together." The next morning, they stood side by side on the steps of the Willow Creek Police Department. The crowd was larger than they had expected. Residents, reporters, and even a few activists from neighboring towns had gathered. Alicia took a deep breath, her hand resting on her belly, and stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "What happened to me wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of something much bigger, something that's been ignored for far too long." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on her. "I'm standing here today not just as the wife of a police chief, but as a black woman who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And I'm standing here for every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong, like they're less than. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." Daniel stepped forward, his presence commanding. "As the chief of this department, I take full responsibility for what happened," he said, his voice steady. "But responsibility isn't enough. We need change. Real, tangible change. And that starts with us, with this department, with this community. We owe it to Alicia, to our unborn child, and to every person in Willow Creek to do better." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. But not everyone was convinced. In the back of the crowd, a group of officers stood with their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. Among them was Officer Harris, his face a mask of guilt and shame. He had spent the last few days replaying the incident in his mind, each time feeling the weight of his actions more acutely. He knew he had messed up, but he wasn't sure how to fix it. Later that evening, Mark sat alone in his living room, the TV muted as images of Alicia and Daniel's speech played on the screen. He felt hollow, like a shell of the man he used to be. His wife, Sarah, sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "You can't keep beating yourself up," she said softly. "You made a mistake, but you can't let it define you." Mark shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. "It's not just a mistake, Sarah. It's who I am, and I don't know how to change that." She leaned in, her voice firm. "You start by owning it, by apologizing, by doing the hard work to be better. You're not a bad person, Mark, but you have to prove that, to yourself, to Alicia, to everyone." The next day, Mark showed up at the Thompsons' doorstep, his uniform neatly pressed but his face pale with nerves. Alicia opened the door, her expression unreadable. "Officer Harris," she said, her tone cautious. "What can I do for you?" Mark swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. I came to apologize," he said, his voice breaking. "What I did was wrong. There's no excuse for it. And I'm so sorry for the pain I caused you and your family." Alicia studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his. Then she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Let's talk," she said simply. Inside, Mark sat across from Alicia and Daniel, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he began, his voice shaky. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better. To being better. I've signed up for bias training, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Apologies are a start," he said. "But actions matter more. If you're serious about change, then prove it. Not just to us, but to the entire community." Alicia leaned forward, her gaze steady. "This isn't just about you, Mark. It's about all of us. About the kind of world we want to live in. If you're willing to be part of that change, then we're willing to give you a chance." Mark nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't let you down." As he left their home, Mark felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption. But the road ahead was long, and the weight of his actions would stay with him for a lifetime. For Alicia and Daniel, the fight was far from over. But as they stood together, hand in hand, they knew they were ready to face whatever came next. Because this wasn't just their story. It was everyone's. And it was only just beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, town halls, and difficult conversations. Willow Creek became a microcosm of the larger national debate about policing, race, and accountability. The town was divided. Some rallied behind Alicia and Daniel, demanding systemic change, while others defended the status quo, insisting that the incident had been blown out of proportion. But through it all, Alicia and Daniel remained steadfast, their commitment to justice unwavering. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the town, Alicia stood at the window of their home, her hand resting on her belly. She could feel the baby kicking, a gentle reminder of the life they were bringing into the world. Daniel walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice soft. Alicia sighed, leaning into him. "I'm tired," she admitted. "But I'm also hopeful. People are listening. Daniel. They're starting to understand that this isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that's been broken for a long time." Daniel nodded, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I know. And we're going to keep pushing. But we also need to take care of ourselves, and this little one." He placed a hand on her belly, smiling as the baby kicked again. "We're in this together, Alicia. Always." The next day, the town held its first community forum on policing reform. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Alicia and Daniel sat at the front, their presence a symbol of hope and resilience. When it was their turn to speak, they stood together, their hands clasped tightly. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Daniel began, his voice echoing through the room. "But it starts with conversations like this. It starts with accountability, with listening, and with a willingness to do better. We owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to future generations to create a community where everyone feels safe and valued." Alicia stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never asked to be the face of this movement," she said. "But if my story can help spark change, then I'll keep telling it. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't matter. And it's about the kind of world we want to leave for our children." The room erupted into applause, but not everyone was convinced. In the back, a group of officers sat with their arms crossed, their expressions guarded. Among them was Mark Harris, his face a mix of guilt and determination. He had been attending the forums, listening to the stories of those who had been hurt by the system he was a part of. It was painful, but he knew it was necessary. After the forum, Mark approached Alicia and Daniel, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They nodded, leading him to a quiet corner of the room. "I just want to say, thank you," Mark began, his voice trembling, "for giving me a chance to be part of this. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm trying. I'm really trying." Alicia studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. "Change isn't easy, Mark," she said. "But it's possible. And it starts with people like you being willing to do the hard work." Daniel placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "We're all in this together," he said. "And if you're serious about making things right, then we'll support you. But the work doesn't stop here. It's just the beginning." Mark nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I won't let you down," he said. "I promise." As the weeks turned into months, the town began to see small but meaningful changes. The police department implemented new training programs focused on bias and de-escalation. Community outreach initiatives were launched, fostering dialogue and understanding between officers and residents. And Alicia and Daniel became symbols of hope, their story inspiring others to stand up for justice. But the journey was far from over. There were setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and frustration. Yet through it all, Alicia and Daniel remained committed to their vision of a better future. And as they welcomed their baby into the world, a beautiful, healthy girl named Hope, they knew that their fight was about more than just themselves. It was about her, and about the world she would grow up in. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the baby sleeping peacefully in Alicia's arms, Daniel turned to her with a smile. "We've come a long way," he said, "but there's still so much work to do." Alicia nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll keep fighting," she said, "for hope, and for every child who deserves a better world." And as the stars twinkled above, casting a soft light over the quiet town, they knew that their story was far from over. It was just one chapter in a larger narrative of hope, resilience, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest moments. And they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The years that followed were a testament to the power of perseverance. Willow Creek, once a town divided, began to heal. The reforms that Alicia and Daniel had fought for started to take root, slowly but surely. The police department became a model for others, with officers like Mark Harris leading the charge in community outreach and bias training. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still voices of resistance, but progress was undeniable. Alicia and Daniel's daughter, Hope, grew up in a world that was far from ideal but filled with promise. She was a bright, curious child, her laughter echoing through their home like a melody. Alicia often found herself watching her daughter play, marveling at her innocence and wondering what kind of world she would inherit. "Do you think we're doing enough?" Alicia asked Daniel one evening as they sat on the porch, Hope chasing fireflies in the yard. Daniel reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We're doing everything we can," he said, "and that's all we can do. Hope will grow up knowing that her parents fought for what's right. That's something to be proud of." But the fight wasn't over. One day, as Alicia was dropping Hope off at school, she noticed a group of parents huddled together, their voices low and urgent. She approached, her curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" she asked. One of the mothers, a woman named Lisa, turned to her, her face etched with worry. "There's been another incident," she said. "A black teenager was stopped by the police last night. They said he fit the description of someone they were looking for, but it doesn't sit right with me. Alicia's heart sank. She had hoped they were past this, that the changes they had fought for would be enough. But the reality was that systemic issues ran deep, and progress was never linear. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. "We need to address this," she said, "before it escalates." That evening, Alicia and Daniel called a meeting at their home. The living room was filled with familiar faces, community leaders, activists, and even a few officers, including Mark. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a shared sense of purpose. "We've come a long way," Alicia began, her voice steady. "But we can't pretend that the work is done. What happened last night is a reminder that we have to stay vigilant. We have to keep pushing for change." Mark stood up, his expression serious. "I'll talk to the officers involved," he said. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. But we also need to hear from the community. What do you need from us? How can we do better?" The room erupted into conversation, voices overlapping as people shared their thoughts and ideas. It was messy and chaotic, but it was real. And in that messiness, Alicia saw hope, not just for her daughter, but for the entire community. As the meeting wrapped up, Daniel pulled Alicia aside. "You're amazing, you know that," he said, his eyes filled with admiration. "You never give up. Even when it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle, you keep going." Alicia smiled, leaning into him. "I have to," she said. "For hope. For everyone. We can't afford to give up." The next morning, Alicia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her scarf and taking a deep breath. She had agreed to speak at a rally downtown, and the weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. Hope tugged at her sleeve, her little face filled with curiosity. "Where are you going, Mommy?" she asked. Alicia knelt down, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "I'm going to talk to some people about how we can make the world a better place," she said. "For you, and for all the other kids like you." Hope tilted her head, her eyes wide. "Can I come?" she asked. Alicia hesitated, then nodded. "Of course you can," she said. "You're part of this too." As they walked hand in hand to the rally, Alicia felt a surge of pride. The crowd was larger than she had expected, a sea of faces filled with hope and determination. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped up to the microphone, Hope by her side. "This is my daughter, Hope," she began, her voice strong and clear. "And she's the reason I'm here today. She's the reason we fight for justice, for equality, for a better world. Because she deserves it. And so do all of you." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy palpable. Alicia looked out at the sea of faces, her heart swelling with emotion. "Change isn't easy," she continued, "but it's possible. And it starts with us. With every voice, every action, every moment we choose to stand up for what's right. So let's keep fighting. For hope. For each other. For the future." As she stepped down from the stage, Daniel wrapped his arms around her, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it," he whispered. "You inspired them." Alicia smiled, her gaze drifting to Hope, who was now dancing in the grass, her laughter ringing out like music. "We did it," she said. "Together." And as the sun set over the town, casting a golden glow over the crowd, Alicia felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was long, and the fight was far from over. But in that moment, surrounded by the people she loved and the community she had fought for, she knew that anything was possible. Because when people came together, united by hope and a shared vision for the future, there was no limit to what they could achieve. And that was a story worth telling.